Hi, my name's Greg Williams. Uh, T4 paraplegic. I was injured October 2nd, 2004. I crashed my motorcycle, and that was, a day that changed my life. But the motorcycling for me had always been a passion, and in fact, I had taken motorcycling and turned it into a writing career. Writing about motorcycles and riding motorcycles has been a passion, and playing with motorcycles, and fortunately, being a paraplegic hasn't stopped me from tinkering with motorcycles. In the beginning, for me, I was restoring them to ride them. I simply do this for the pleasure, and whether I keep the bike, whether I sell the bike, it's simply a hobby and a way to, if you will, keep occupied. For me, it didn't matter what type of motorcycle it was, what size it was. I've always liked them all. Two wheels and a motor, and I was interested. From 50cc to 1200cc. Having said that, my favorite bikes are British bikes, and the Triumphs, the Nortons, the BSAs. I do like older stuff, much older stuff, stuff from the teens. I've never owned a motorcycle from the teens, but there's a lot going on with those, a lot of levers, a lot of belts, a lot of action. For me, though, Triumph has been a passion of mine. I've been interested in motorcycles since I was about 8 or 9 years old. I read a book when I was young called Mini Bike Hero by an author named Claire Mackay, and it was about a young man who buys a mini bike and eventually rescues a young child from a flood, and that was a great influence on me. And then, of course, I saw a mini bike during a family camping trip, and I had to have one. I think I was about 10 when I was able to secure the purchase of a derelict mini bike. I paid $25 for it, and with the help of my dad, we completely fixed that little machine so that it ran. And of course, you couldn't get me off it. I was about 18, went out to visit a friend who was living in Saskatoon with his dad, and in the garage were several motorcycles. I think there were maybe 3 or 4 Harley Davidsons, and in the corner one lone Triumph. And I walked right past everything else and sat on the Triumph and thought, this is a real motorcycle. And it was an old bike, and I knew it was an old bike, and I had to have one. So I worked washing dishes. I worked as many jobs as I could. Finally bought myself an old Triumph, a 1971 TR6R, and rode that bike to college, where I was taking journalism, and rode it to work. And from that introduction, that 1971 Triumph, it's just fostered a huge interest in old motorcycles. So working on motorcycles from a chair does pose some challenges. I thankfully have a friend or two who will come over and lend a hand when it comes time to put an engine into a frame, or install heavy items, front forks, that kind of thing. But I have found that most times with a good lift, I'm able to brace myself against something and be able to tighten, loosen bolts, lift something a little heavier into the frame if I need to. I did restore a 1966 Honda Super Hawk, and I was able to do, I would say, 75% of the work myself, including running the wiring harness, getting the connectors hooked up inside the headlight shell and everywhere else. Like I said, it does pose some challenges, but you become accustomed to what you're going to be able to do, and you do realize your limitations. But for the most part, if if you enjoy working on something, I don't see why you'd have to stop. So after my motorcycle accident, um, I knew I was a writer, and thankfully I still had my hands, I still had my mind. I would no longer be riding or test driving motorcycles or vehicles, but being able to sit down and work at a computer, at a keyboard, that's what I did before, and that's what I continue to do. And I mentioned writing for motorcycle magazines, but one of the best writing gigs that I have is for the Calgary Herald, for the driving section. And the Herald was really good to me during my rehab. I was working for about 6 years prior to the accident for the Herald, and my accident was October, and by June the following year, 2005, I had decided that it was probably time to get back and do some work. And thankfully, the Herald, they didn't have any problem with that. We adjusted a few things, but I was able to get right back into my role writing for the Calgary Herald driving section. Chose to be a freelance writer, and sort of sat down and tried to think about what I knew. Motorcycles seemed to be a pretty good topic, so pretty much since 1996, I've written almost solely for motorcycle magazines, and usually vintage motorcycle magazines. And not that that was an easy road to travel down, but I'm now a contributor to several motorcycle magazines, including Cycle Canada, Antique Motorcycle Club of America. They put out a magazine called The Antique Motorcycle, Motorcycle Classics, and I do write about custom Harley-Davidsons for American Iron magazine. Playing with old motorcycles, it's introduced me to a number of fantastic people, and being a writer, I'm always aware of stories. And one of the great Western Canadian motorcycling stories that I know of was the story of Bernie Nicholson and his writing of 7 editions of a book called Modern Motorcycle Mechanics, which has sold more than 100,000 copies worldwide. And I always felt that there was more to his story than just a magazine article, and that's where it had stood for me since 1996. And back in 2009, I decided that it was time to write Bernie Nicholson's story, and I was able to do that with my book here, Prairie Dust Motorcycles and a Typewriter. It's itself an award-winning book. I'm really proud of that. But more than that, I'm proud that it was Western Canadian pioneers in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, who, one man who was able to write 7 editions of a book and sell more than 100,000 copies worldwide.